Hi, welcome to Limitless, EUTV's Women's Day interview series, where we're speaking to different women that are highly successful in their careers and hearing what they have to say about their experiences. My guest right now is Professor Sarah Childs, who is the personal chair of gender and politics at the University of Edinburgh. She's got an extensive background in both research and teaching, including about the theory and practice of women's political representation, both in Holyrood and in Westminster. And thank you so much for agreeing to being here. In fact, I feel like most politics students at the university would have come across your work at some point, and I myself have as well. And it's been really great to understand gender and the role it plays in politics through your work. So the first question I've got for you is, you've been involved in studying gender and politics since your postgraduate studies. What was it that inspired you to choose that niche in particular?
I think it actually goes back before university. When I was at a sixth form college a long time ago now, I was able to do a non-examined course in women's studies, which got me interested in questions of gender. I then did a politics degree, quite an atypical politics degree with African and Asian studies at the University of Sussex. And wherever I could, I was interested in questions of gender, whether that was in South Africa or Egypt or Soviet revolutionary times. So I kind of curated my own degree by looking at gender in all of those kind of places, in all of those courses. And then at that time, British politics was the furthest from what I wanted to be studying. I then went off and did a master's in women's studies at the University of York, and that's where I really developed a greater understanding about gender as theory, gender as a kind of approach to studying politics. And then I found myself doing a PhD, and when I say found myself, it was really, I hadn't really planned to do it. Nobody in my family had done anything like that before, but that's where it started, and then I just kept going, really. As you do research, you find more questions that you've left unanswered, and you get more questions prompted, and new questions arise, developments arise, and so it just kind of went on from there, really.
Lovely. Now, why do you think women's studies is an important subject, and what's taken so long for it to become such an important part of political study?
So one of my courses when I was an undergraduate, I was criticised by my then tutor for reading too narrowly, and I was really cross with him because I hadn't read narrowly. I'd read very deeply. It's just that he felt that reading about gender was narrow. So I think I took umbrage with him and felt that this wasn't fair. And so some of it is about the resistance of institutions to understanding gender, but I think many of us who work in feminist political science would say that gender power relations are everywhere, and if they're everywhere, they need to be studied and taken seriously. So what we're doing in many ways is responding to what looks like seemingly ungendered or non-gendered research and analysis or practices, and recognizing the way in which they're highly masculinized, and therefore looking to see what or the ways in which gender plays out, is reproduced, those kind of hierarchies, and really investigating those kind of questions. So some of it was about having sufficient numbers within the university to do lots of research, because when there was only a very few, if you think back to some of the mentors that inspired me, there were only a very few of them doing gendered research. So it was challenging to the traditional scholars and the traditional scholarship. So in a sense, we need a few generations so that we become more numerous, and therefore we can have greater amounts of research and becoming more diverse as well. And so in a sense, it's taken some time because you needed to bring people up through the university sector, through the undergraduate, through postgraduate, then becoming lecturers, and then up to professors, and increasing that presence within the profession.
You know, because I feel like a lot of my friends as well now, they're quite interested in women's studies. I've got some that are doing your courses as well. But when I first started looking into applying to universities as well, there wasn't as much direct focus. It was just the smaller courses. You couldn't actually choose your major to be women's studies for most. So I think it's really important that people like you are helping, spread that around.
I mean, it wasn't very long ago where universities, if they had in one politics department one person who did gender, that was like, we've done gender now. We've got one person, we don't need any more. And I think increasingly it's recognised that gender as an approach to the study of politics requires a multitude of people working in that area.
Definitely. Now, obviously, you're incredibly well published. What is it that keeps you constantly researching and constantly writing?
I think there's a number of things. I think the first is that as you do research, you're never able to do everything on a particular project. So there's always new inspiration. There's always something at the back of your mind that you think you haven't interrogated properly, or you haven't sufficiently explored, or you want to extend the understanding. So there's a sense in which it generates subsequent research as you establish findings, or you go and work in one place and then you think, well, is that true of another place? I think that's one thing. I think I don't run out of ideas. There's always too much to do rather than too little. I think the second thing is collaborations, and I would really emphasize this, that I have benefited from some fantastic collaborations with authors in the UK, but also in Europe and in the States. And I think collaboration, which we might think of also as a kind of principle of feminist doing of politics or political research, academic research as well, and that really, it inspires. You can become braver when there's more than one of you, because you can think things that if you were on your own you think, well, I'm not sure I really feel confident enough to look at X or say Y, whereas if there's more than one of you, you kind of spreading the responsibility. So I think that has made a difference. Also, if you're very busy with teaching and doing research, and maybe doing impactful research, like working with parliaments, having collaborators also forces you to carry on with your research, because they're expecting something from you. So there's a dynamism when you do collaborative research. I think the third point I would also say, and this is about being fortunate, but also being supported by good universities over the years, which is that doing research takes time and it's exhausting oftentimes. And we need sabbaticals. So yeah, when you say I've published a lot, some of that, particularly the book length research, it's very hard. I've never been able to write a book without having a period of study leave from the university. So that's about to what extent do universities have the funding to support excellent academic research? To what extent can you be competitive in the grant, the external grant funding? And I have had a very fortunate career in getting grants at critical times, which have enabled me to produce a number of books as well as the other publications. So I think we also need to think about resourcing, precariousness within universities, and the fact that I've been very lucky in the universities that I've worked for, who have been committed to supporting academic research in addition to teaching.
I was just curious, what made you choose Edinburgh in particular, and do you have a favorite course that you've taught so far?
So why Edinburgh? Well, there's two reasons. Okay, the first is that it has a very established tradition of doing gender and politics research, going back to previous professors, Alice Brown, Professor Fiona Mackay and Meryl Kenny. So we have, Edinburgh has a good reputation globally for investing, supporting and celebrating gender and politics research. And if you remember one of my answers previously, that's not true of all universities. So I think Edinburgh's always been an institution that I felt values gender and politics research, and therefore it was always kind of one of my possible other places. Having been in Bristol, which is a very good university, and also having been in London, where obviously there's a parliament, I would have had to have moved to a city that I also wanted to live in. And Edinburgh has a parliament. It's a capital city. It's beautiful. It has water. So when you decide to take a job, it's a combination of the department, the colleagues, the institution, and for me, the city as well.
Right.
So I also have some non-biological but kind of family outside Edinburgh, so I'd always had good links with Edinburgh. But to be honest, the bottom line is that it was a good department with gender and politics scholars I wanted to be amongst, and I felt that this institution would really support my research.
That's lovely. And any favorite courses you've taught?
So I'm teaching gender power and representation, which is a course that was previously run by Meryl Kenny. And when we talked about me taking it over while she had other responsibilities, it was very similar to a course I taught previously at other places. So in a sense, that's wonderful because I get to explore theories of representation with students, but also apply it. And I think that's also one of the, for me, really valuable aspects of gender and politics research. It can be very much about abstract normative principles. What does a feminist democratic politics look like? But it can also be very, how do we get into an institution and help it become more gender sensitive? So I like the impactful research as well as the theory, and I guess my career has managed to combine increasingly theory and empirical research.
Definitely. Coming to, again, in relation to teaching, there's some sort of a misconception among students that gender studies and women's studies are to be studied only by women. And you'll find that a lot of men are quite hesitant to take up those courses. So what would you have to say about that?
what I've found in the past is there are always a few men on the courses I teach, and this isn't true at Edinburgh because I've not had this set of experiences for other reasons that are not related to the answer. But actually, where I've taught British politics to first and second years, then I see an increasing relationship with the number of men who take my courses. So I think when there may be male students who don't know what this course is going to be like, don't know what the tutor is going to be like, there may be a greater reluctance. But I think when they have seen you teach other aspects of politics, there's almost a reassurance.
Right.
But I think there are often misconceptions. There is sometimes, and I think this is problematic, that people, and this isn't just about male students, I think it can be about scholars, I think it can be about the general public, I think it can be about politicians who think that there is something called objective analysis, and then there's bias.
Right.
And that if it's got gender in it, it must be feminist, it must be biased. And I think sometimes there can be a misconception that if you're not self-identifying as a feminist, you shouldn't do this course. I think all the course requires of you is to take seriously the literature. So you could write a first-class answer that, in a way that I might disagree with the substance, but it could still be a first-class answer because it's about the academic quality of the argument you present. I think the other problem with those kind of misconceptions is that it thinks that other courses that aren't gendered are not normative or political. So I think there's a number of things going on. Sometimes there are assumptions about the kind of people who teach it, sometimes about the content, sometimes about the fear perhaps of feeling uncomfortable in class, or whether it requires a particular kind of position. And I'd like to think that we can open up those conversations, and I think sometimes it's about meeting people and having greater interaction so that people understand the kind of course it is.
Right. This year I've decided to take a lot more South Asia related courses, but I'm definitely looking into doing gender for next year because I've got one more year left. So hopefully you'll see me in your course.
That'd be great.
Now, like you said, you've been directly involved in parliamentary reform. You've written the Good Parliament report with Westminster, and then more recently Parliament for All at Holyrood. So what is it that goes into firstly suggesting such reform and then actually seeing it enacted?
Well, those two were quite different in some ways, although they're both about subjecting to parliaments to gender-sensitive audits and then creating recommendations and then working with the parliaments to see as many of those recommendations implemented as you can. The difference is that in Westminster, I rather individually and rather presumptuously invited myself in and said, I want to come in, I want to write this report, I want to give you recommendations, and luckily they let me in, and there's a story behind that. Whereas in Holyrood, the Parliament made the decision before I arrived at Westminster, and Professor Merrill Kenny and Professor Fiona Mackay had already been talking to them about this. So when I arrived, I became part of that team who supported the gender-sensitive audit, and now both Merrill and I sit on the presiding officer's advisory board around gender-sensitive parliaments. So they had different starting points, but at another level, of course, what they're trying to do is identify the insensitivities that exist in those two places and then create what I like to think of as sort of politically viable and technically accurate reforms that can address some of those insensitivities and make sure the parliaments are more inclusive and diverse, gender sensitive, family friendly, all of those kind of ideas in play.
Right. No, because my father himself, without having any connection to the university, he'd read your work and I mentioned you, and he's like, oh, I have heard of this person. I didn't even know they were teaching at your university. I said yes. And then, obviously he went through all of your work, and it's just beautifully written as well. He has a lot of great things to say about it. Your career spans many, many years of both teaching and especially research. What would you consider to be the pinnacle of your career so far?
I think there are two ways for me to answer that. The first is a very small piece of work I did, which is not the most significantly cited or necessarily the most expansive, but it was a small piece about the reduction of VAT on sanitary products a long time now ago under New Labour, and I just had this interview comment that talked about from a woman MP saying, look, I'm just going to get all the women to do this. I'm going to get them all to sign this particular motion. And I thought afterwards, when that was part of another project, I thought I'm just going to investigate what happened. And so that tiny question or comment begged so many things that I wanted to find out. And then I wrote this piece trying to understand that change. So that's a piece that I think in many ways I I really like as a piece of research, because it was prompted by a statement and then I followed it through. And then I think the other, and this is probably one that would be more widely recognised, and it's on the more impactful side, which is the change to the standing orders down at Westminster that allows MPs who are on baby leave to vote by a proxy.
Right.
And that was one of the recommendations coming out of the Good Parliament report. And I worked with the then Speaker and a group of MPs, the Commons Reference Group, and the then Mother of the House, Harriet Harman, and over a period of time we worked to get that principle established and then the practice trialled, and ultimately became a change to the standing order. And I was in the House the evening of the vote, and so I witnessed the actual passing of that new standing order. So that's a clear, that was quite a moment to watch that happen, and then see MPs who, particularly on that first occasion, Tulip Sadiq, who delayed her cesarean in order to vote for one of the Brexit votes, be able to have her baby and to signal her vote by using a proxy. So that's probably the most significant change.
It must have been super exhilarating to just see that and experience it in person.
It was, absolutely.
Now, for anyone, politics students or otherwise, that are looking into a career in either academics or research, what would you recommend their starting steps be?
I think increasingly I would say that doing a research master's where you really hone your research skills. So if you're thinking very practically about the possibility of doing a PhD or doing research in a private or a social research company in not outside of academia, I think developing your research skills, so ensuring perhaps that your dissertation involves some new empirical research, but then probably investing in gaining some additional skills, both quantitative and qualitative, so that you really have a good grounding, so that when you decide that there's a question that you just have to answer, you're able to answer it using the best method. So I think that is a very practical step, and I've encouraged some students to do that. And then I think if you have the opportunity, and not everybody does, is to do work in an area that you really care about, because doing a PhD or doing research can be quite lonely, it can be quite hard work. It's emotionally hard, as well as the very sort of everyday keeping going, motivating yourself. So I think doing something that you care about gives you that extra dynamic. And then I think you have to create a community around you to support you. So in some ways it's not that different from being an undergraduate, because you need others to read your work, comment on it, to fire you up, to get you going, and to be kind of those who will tell you when something isn't quite working. So I think creating a community around you as well.
Perfect. That's all from my side. Is there anything else you would like to share? Or
no, maybe going back to your point about undertaking, the course that we teach, the courses we teach here on gender, is that I really would want everyone to think that that's a place for them. And just like any other class, it's about engaging properly with the material, seriously with the material. And if anybody wants to talk about taking that class with me and has any concerns, just come and see me in an office hour, send me an email, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about that.
Sure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.